Hi everyone, welcome. What you see out here on the bench are a couple of my European nightcrawler bins which have been undergoing horizontal migration now for 12 days. These systems have now aged 346 days, and that horizontal migration feeding that we put out there 12 days ago, that registered as feeding number 30, and I'm preparing to come back in here today with a little bit more food just to keep the horizontal feeding zones replenished and stocked with food. Nothing as fancy as they got last time. Last time they got stuff like cantaloupe and little bits of zucchini, potato peels. Today they're getting coffee, and I guess I'll try to dress it up a little bit with some of my worm chow. But I don't think the worms are overly particular. They'll pretty much be happy to eat whatever they want. I believe that the main thing that tends to motivate the worms to gravitate towards the migration zone, where I'd like to eventually try to round them all up and haul them out. I believe that the main thing that motivates them over there is the moisture content. And it's for that reason this side of the bin, or these sides of the bins, has been left uncovered to permit air to, suck out the moisture content of these systems through evaporation. And, humidity is starting to rise here. Summer months are encroaching. Technically, the official start of summer has not yet arrived. It's still maybe a week away, but we're definitely starting to feel the warming in my region. So, in my region, at least, the warming comes hand in hand with increased humidity in the air. So the humid air prevents things from drying out very much. So as much as I would like to see this material out here become much drier and much less hospitable for worms to remain in, it is kind of a slow process, and it is sort of necessary to help it by not allowing things to impede the evaporation. So that's why I've removed covers. Up until last time, these systems had been covered with a piece of newspaper and then with a piece of cardboard. And then last time we just did away with all the covers when we originally set up this migration of the worms. So after 12 days, I would like to think that the migration's coming along pretty good. And it was for that reason I actually went ahead and I set up some fresh bedding with which I intend to build a couple new worm bins for the day that will arrive soon, but won't be today, for that day when we finally haul the worms out of their material. So we're really just here to not only replenish the food supply in the horizontal migration feeding zones, but I'd also like to, at the same time, try to aerate the material in the bins so that that really damp material that's at the very bottom can also be brought out to the surface, where it too has a chance to kick off a little bit of its moisture. So I think we'll actually begin with that. And I guess by doing so, that'll give us the opportunity to possibly increase the size of the feeding zone a little bit. It looks to me like these perforated cardboard partitions that I like to put in my worm bins when I'm setting up migrations like this, it looks like they're still holding up well enough to be reused one more time, as long as I don't bump into them and tear them up into little pieces. It seems to me like this material that's right up against the cardboard is the stuff that's most likely to have a good amount of moisture content. That stuff seems to me like the material that would be best served by being placed out near the top surface to start releasing some of its moisture. And naturally, all that stuff that was on the surface, the more dry material, will have a chance to go down and sink down a little bit lower. Yeah, these partitions are getting gobbled up as the worms, sense that there's more moisture and there's food over on the other side of these cardboard partitions. They not only pass through them, but they do tend to nibble on it a little bit as well. Not to mention just the fact that they've been, inundated with moisture for the past 12 days. That also contributes quite a bit to their breakdown. Well, I'm starting to question whether these are going to be worthy of another round. It might be a worthwhile extra effort to just go and grab a few more pieces of cardboard that we can replace these with, because they are pretty shot. Yeah, I think that's probably the better bet. It seemed to me like they might be holding out, but now that we're taking a closer look, it does seem like they're probably due for a swap out. This too is a piece of that same stuff, the cardboard, perforated cardboard. So I think by doing that, we also have the opportunity to get a lot closer to the actual feeding zone. Besides the cardboard, I'd also used a little piece of this newspaper here. As you can see, it sort of helped reinforce where the feeding zone begins and where the finished castings end. So that's pretty much our feeding zone over there. I'd like to also do the same treatment to the other bin before we get too far along, because when I'm doing this side-by-side setup like this, I try to pretend like I'm working in one large system. So I don't know, it's not even really pretending, because it doesn't feel like I'm working on one big system. But at times I am able to trick my mind into believing that what I've got in front of me is just one big system, but I don't think I'm that easily tricked. So yeah, the material out here on the surface of this bin too is pretty dry from having just been sitting out here exposed to the air for the past 12 days, but you don't have to go very deep to get into material that's quite damp, and I believe due to that reason still quite heavily occupied with worms. So I am fairly convinced that regardless of what yummy foods we put out into the horizontal migration feeding zone for them, we're not really luring the worms over there, I believe. I mean, I really feel like maybe the better motivation for worms to do something like move out of their finished castings into a space where you're going to want to try to collect them later is to really drive them out in a way, as opposed to try to lure them over. And driving them out is always, I think, most easily achieved by just simply letting the material dry. I mean, there's other similar methods to separating worms from their castings where driving them out of the material is spurred on more by using light to force them down deeper into the material. So there again, that's another repulsion-based technique that works pretty well. And those techniques do seem to be the most dominantly used. I think other methods that I've seen people use is sort of just agitating the material to kind of annoy the worms into diving down. And I would think that to a certain point that also is helped out by the fact that there's probably a certain amount of light present in the area that they're also trying to get away from, that they're also repelled by. So I do almost feel like it's time to take a quick break, since I didn't come prepared with replacement partitions, because it does seem like if we were to place the replacement partitions in here temporarily before finishing up, that would give us a slightly easier space to work here and be able to more readily till this material and stir it around a little bit. So I'm going to take a short break here, go fashion a couple replacements like this full of holes, and then I'll be right back. So, just so happens that those two pieces of cardboard that I had that were covering these systems were still laying around, and this one that had the more obvious grease stains on it. These are pizza boxes, by the way, that's why they're so greasy. Pepperoni. I figured I'd use this one, this piece of cardboard, since it was the most heavily soiled of the two, and put it to good use. So what I was referring to earlier in terms of just being able to guard our finished castings from getting contaminated, I was just really thinking that, you know, none of the stuff that's over in the feeding zone would get mixed in with the nice finished castings if we were to cover up our feeding zone temporarily while we try to get a little bit more a little bit more zealous, a little bit more into the tilling of the material here, so we don't have to be so careful in terms of keeping everything separate. Not that it would be such a big deal, but this way I don't feel like I've got to take such care, and I could really focus more on just the action of tilling the material around and getting some of the more damp stuff that's down low out to the surface, while at the same time submerging some of the more dry stuff, hopefully blending it all together in the process and resulting in material that's a little bit more dry in the end after having done this. And it does seem to me like this aeration process also leaves behind little pockets of air in between everything, which may or may not even help. And it's kind of hard to imagine that a little pocket of air down beneath the surface of the material would even help any in terms of drying the material in general. But who knows? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But we're going to do it anyway, because it does seem like periodic aerations and stirring of the material does eventually help the material dry, perhaps dislodging stuff that would otherwise stay clumped together in a big wet mass, and kind of breaking it apart, helping it hopefully release some of its moisture content along the way. Also at the same time combining it with some of the drier stuff that was out on the surface that's now being submerged as a result of the stirring. So it's, just make sure we don't encroach on the space that's set aside for the feeding zone over there. So I figured maybe we would even try to expand on that space slightly if possible once we reset here, although as a result of that we would end up needing to stack all this finished castings material up taller, which I think might impede its ability to dry further. So I guess there is sort of a trade-off there. We need to gauge the benefit and use only a little bit if we think it's even worth using any at all. But it does seem like if we add maybe an extra ½ an inch over here to increase that space, it'll just create more room for the worms to be able to move into over there. Maybe. Some of it I kind of wonder if it even makes that much of a difference. I mean, I just did the haul out, the first haul out of one of my other bins the other day, and it did seem like we had a pretty nice turnout, and that was also, I believe, due in large part to the fact that we allowed a great deal of time for the castings to dry out, quite possibly becoming the motivation that the worms needed to move on over into the feeding zone, where they found themselves more damp and more comfortable material to be in, material that also had a supply of food for them waiting there, so that they would also stay, not just go there and stumble on it and find that they like it, but also stay. But I don't know, I'm just sort of taking observations that I see and trying to correlate them to what I believe they mean. So whether the conclusions I'm making based on the stuff that I'm seeing are even true, I don't know. I could be completely wrong, but I'm just kind of sharing the things that I find seem to work for me. And I guess the main trick here would have been to just never even allow the material to get quite this damp. To have basically anticipated the more humid summer air coming soon, and then perhaps even months ago start allowing the system to breathe a little bit more, rather than, you know, always coming back on with the plastic covers. So gradually getting wise to that, but perhaps in some cases it's already a little bit too late, requiring a whole bunch of extra time to try to facilitate the exit of the worms from their material using this migration method. So I think we've tilled up the material sufficiently over here. I believe just by doing so, it seems like we've, by introducing all these little air pockets and declumping a lot of the material, it does seem like we've come awfully close to the top rim of the container here. True, we'll have a chance to sort of backfill a little bit up against the cardboard partition momentarily. And I guess the one thing that you see me doing here is something I probably don't want to be doing, is kind of pushing the material together this way and kind of clumping it up as a result. I believe it is better to try to declump it every chance I get and not press it into a big mass if possible. But I think we're now at that stage where we can do our reset of the feeding zones, level off, and let the process continue. All right, here again I'm pressing the material when I probably shouldn't be. Perhaps instead of trying to press it up against the stuff right next to it, it's better to just bring it out here to the surface, even though I'm stacking it so high I worry that I'm gonna spill it. I just got to be careful. Okay, let's get this job wrapped up here. So the feeding zones, now we get to take a little peek to see how progress is coming. Perhaps these old pieces can also be down here to sort of help a little bit, since the bottom is where it seems to really get worn heavily due to the moisture content and the worm traffic. So I'd like to hope that our migration is doing good, that we've got a nice turnout. All right, we do seem to have a nice turnout. A lot of people are probably thinking to themselves, why not just haul them out? They're already there in your hand. Move them into a new home. Well, I don't really have their new home ready to go yet. I spent some time yesterday, finally, taking a bunch of shredded paper I made the day before, shredded paper cardboard mix, combining it with a bunch of leaves and moisture. So I have actually prepared a whole bunch of bedding with which I'm going to prepare their new homes. I also needed to free up some containers. So I'm gradually bringing together the elements required to do a haul out of some worms from these systems at some point in the near future, but not today. I'm going to do what I usually do, which is do the expansion of the feeding zone on the far end, so that the stuff closest to the finished castings is stuff that's already well underway in the breakdown process. Got a big piece of cantaloupe rind, pretty much reduced to something that's kind of paper thin at this point. All the nice stuff has been nibbled off and eaten, and that stuff too will get eaten right there, but they always go for what's soft and easy first, and then eventually polish off the more tricky stuff that's tougher to eat later. Yeah, looks like we've done pretty good over here too in terms of getting some worms to hang out. This piece right here though, there is something about it. You can always sense that there's still some of the melon attached to the rind, because it doesn't kind of flop around like a piece of paper. It still has a little bit of rigidity because of the fruit that's still attached to it. Very nice. Good to see a nice turnout occurring in these horizontal migration feeding zones. But you got to admit, when we were stirring through the finished castings, there were still a whole lot of worms left to be migrated and to depopulate their castings. So the migration will definitely need to continue on. I guess the nice thing about what we're doing here today is that I don't have that feeling like I'm dumping a bunch of frozen stuff on top of the worms when all I've got for them is coffee. I know that I'm not running the risk of putting any of my little worm friends into a deep freeze situation that they might not like. So I'm just really quickly thinking that it would be a good idea to try to get a lot of these little itsy bitsy worms off my glove. Even before, when I took a short break to make up these little partitions, after I shut off the camera, I did take a moment or two to remove the little tiny worms that were stuck to my glove, because some of them are so small they could easily just be missed. And I would hate the idea of harming even one of these little itsy bitsy guys. So let's just see what we could do about returning them all down into the bin before we proceed here. Alright, looks like we did a pretty decent job. Now I've got my prepared bedding here that we're going to use to build out a little bit of extra space for them in the feeding zone. Because a little bit more bedding material, I believe, is probably not going to hurt either. You saw that there was still a good amount of like newspaper bits and other types of leftover bedding materials from the initial setup of these horizontal migration feeding zones. But when I do this, I do like to try to build out the space for them a little bit in anticipation of more worms arriving soon. Try not to be stingy. I got plenty of this shredded cardboard paper leaf mixture, so why not use it, right? And then I'll usually try to place the food into the far end of the bin so that they're motivated to go all the way over there and make room for more coming right behind them. Now, the other thing I'll do sometimes after I place in my coffee is to try to spice it up a little bit and make it a little bit more interesting for them by also adding a little bit of my worm chow, which I showed you a moment ago. And hopefully the combination of nice fresh bedding, a little bit of coffee, both going in here sort of damp, combined with the worm chow, which is obviously going in dry but probably doesn't really make that much of a difference. Hopefully what we're doing here for them is creating a nice environment that's going to accommodate even more and more worms coming over into the migration zone. Okay, getting there. All right, so horizontal migration feeding zones I think are quite obvious, so usually by this point in the game I don't worry so much about trying to mark where the feeding zone was because it's so obvious. So rather than using these coffee filters as feeding zone indicators, which is what I traditionally do with them, I'm just adding them to the feeding zone as supplementary bedding material. Now I think that's pretty much what we're after here, right? So let's come back in here in such a way that we nudge things over again. That seems like about a good amount. And then as we backfill, that'll allow that little partition to stand up pretty much straight. And then we can try to level things off here. Try to do so in a way that leaves little air gaps and little pockets so that evaporation is possibly even helped out a little bit by that, instead of matting everything down and pushing it down into a flat surface that might have a harder time kicking off some of its moisture content. Here too, I'm just going to try to compress the feeding zone slightly just to give ourselves a little bit more space into which we can backfill and level off. And the final thing to go on is going to be couple plastic sheets, which are really there to help the material in the feeding zone remain damp and not lose any of its moisture, which is the opposite of what we're doing out here in the finished casting side, which is trying to actually promote the drying of the material by leaving it completely uncovered. So you might remember last time we were in here, I had covered up with just these little pieces of bubble wrap, but it felt to me like giving them a little bit more protection from drying would be a good idea, and that's the reason I came in here later after the fact, after the video was complete, and I put these in here in such a way that there'd be virtually no moisture loss out of the feeding area by covering it all up, even the cardboard, which could possibly suck some moisture into itself and then release it into the air. Perhaps if I cover the cardboard up slightly as well, that too might help with the retention of the moisture down here, which is, I'm pretty convinced, which is I think one of the main reasons the worms will stay if they come over here. So we're done with our check-in now on our European nightcrawlers, day 346 after 12 days of migration, and the migration continues. How much longer it'll take, I don't know. It's anyone's guess. I think it really depends on how long it takes for this stuff out here to dry. All right, everyone, I got a few things I got to take care of getting put away and cleaned up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.